Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of talks, Have You Thought of a Career in Medical Research? My name is Natalie Ford, and today we have three guests with us. We have Joanne Martens, Daniel Okana, and Demetrios Dotsinos. They'll be talking in that order about their research and their careers. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So we have Joanna, who's going to talk a bit about what she's been doing and her career and how she got to where she is now. Joanna.
So hi, everyone. As Natalie said, I'm Joanna Martens, and I'm a biomedical engineer. So I developed medical devices for shoulder tendon healing, but more of that a bit later. So when I was in high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do after that. So I knew I liked science, I liked math, I like art, I liked a little bit of everything. But in terms of what to do for a career, I didn't know exactly what to do. So I always knew I wanted to follow a career in science, in health, but I didn't want medicine, I didn't want nursing, and no engineering, please. So I was a bit lost. In the end, I decided to go for pathology. So I studied a year of pathology, but I thought it was very routine work, that I would be doing the same things every single day, and I didn't want that. So after a year, I decided to switch to something else. But again, what could that be? So back home in Portugal, at the time we had a very heavy book of all of the courses, all of the degrees that we could do in Portugal. So I decided to go one by one, page by page, to figure out if anything there would catch my eye. And one of them was bioengineering. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And remember, I said I didn't want engineering at all. But in the end, I did manage to go into bioengineering. It was very recent at the time. It was maybe 2 or 3 years old. So it wasn't very clear in terms of job prospects, but it had a bit of everything in there. I had health, science, math. So I thought, why not? Let's go take a risk. So in the end, I did find it was a very interesting course. So I specialized in terms, I did a master's degree. So I specialized in biomedical engineering under the bioengineering umbrella with focus on biomaterials. So biomaterials are materials that can be synthetic or man-made or natural. And then they are manipulated or processed in ways that then can be used to interact with biological systems. So for instance, with the skin or lungs or muscle. So they can be used as part of implants or drug delivery systems, or just externally to the skin as wound dressings. So just to give you an idea of what kind of projects you could do with this degree, in my master's thesis, I was working on a way to control the behavior of stem cells. So when the baby is born, the parents can sometimes choose to collect and store the stem cells that are within the umbilical cord. But in some cases, so these stem cells will then be used to help with treatments if there is any, the child has any disease later on. But the problem is that sometimes with stem cells, there's not an enough number of cells for the treatment to work. So we need to grow them and multiply them. But stem cells, they have the ability to differentiate, so to change into different types of cells. And sometimes they do this just because they want to, without us controlling that. But while we want the cells to grow, we want them to remain unchanged. So I was working on an hydrogel, which is very similar to gelatin, has the same consistency, to kind of control the behavior of the cells just by biophysical cues, so by the structure of it. And this was done in a way to simulate the environment where the cells were in the umbilical cord. So this is just one of the things that you could do, for instance. After that, after uni, I did a bit more of this, and then I came to Oxford. And my first job here in Oxford was a tissue collector. So sometimes patients would go into the hospital and they would have routine surgeries, for instance, for shoulder repair or knee repair or hip repair. And in some cases, as part of the surgery, there was going to be a bit of tissue, a bit of tendon, for instance, that would go to waste. So as part of my job, I would go into these surgeries with patient's consent and I will collect that little bit of tendon. Then I will go into the lab and take all the cells out that I could, grow them and multiply them. And then I will give these cells to other researchers for them to do their own experiments on them. So this, leading on from that, I moved to the project where I am right now, where we are developing two medical devices. So one of them is called Biorn and is a suture, a thread, and the other is a patch and it's called Biopatch. So these two devices work for healing the tendon in the shoulder. So sometimes what happens due to injury or age is that there is a tear in the shoulder. So that means that you can't move your arm up and down without feeling very, very painful. And this can really affect, obviously, your work if you're doing manual work, but also your quality of life, because it can impact your life in very many different stages. For instance, you can't even hold a kettle to pour tea, for instance, or you can't even hug your loved ones without pain. So usually what happens in worst case scenarios, the patient will go to the hospital, have a surgery, and during the surgery, they would stitch the two ends of the tendon back together. Unfortunately, in some cases, the tendon, because it's already in a bad state, would just slip apart after a while. So then the patient will need a second surgery to correct that. So obviously this means more time, more recovery time, costs for the patient and for the hospital. So we are trying to avoid that. So the way that Biopatch and Biorn work is that they are synthetic, they're made of synthetic materials that are degradable. So when they are implanted into the patient, they are stitched up or just put on top of that, of the tendon that is being pulled back together. And the way that it works is that the cells are going to communicate with the materials, with the structure of these devices. And it's going to encourage the cells to grow and create a new tissue. And because they are degradable, after a few months, there is no material left, just the new tendon. So this avoids a second surgery. So this is a work that I find very rewarding and very challenging as well, because it's you have to deal with many different things while working on this. So on this job, my official job description is research assistant, but that can actually mean very different things depending on the project that you're doing. In this case, it means that I'm wearing many different hats. So one day I can go to the lab and do manufacturing, so just producing these devices. Then the next day I'm doing quality control, so checking everything was done as this was supposed to be. And then the next day I'm doing regulatory work. So this means looking at the standards, at all the regulations, see if there's any tests that we need to do and experiments and how to do them as well. And then the following day, I'm doing documentation management. So writing paperwork, so writing protocols, writing reports for all these experiments that we need to do. And it's all based on the idea, if it's not written, it didn't happen. So we have to have everything that we do written. And this is all to prove that the device is safe and that it works. So the goal of this is then later go into clinical trials. So that's why we need to do every single work before that. So I find this work is very rewarding, as I said, because then we have a goal in mind that is to help people, to help improve the quality of life. And it's very challenging, but surprisingly, I do like the regulatory part of it because so the regulatory side gives us guidance to what we need to do, but it can be very dry and heavy, but it's actually like a puzzle that we need to figure out how we can implement this to our projects without being a burden, that is still we can do in a practical and safe way. So just a little bit, so I've been doing this for the last 5 years. I'm going to share the link for a YouTube video that we have for how the Biopatch works, a little animation that you guys can see after. And just a little bit of advice, because now you're at the stage where you need to choose what you want to do. Just try to follow your interests, what you like. And if you don't know what you like, because you're still young, try different things. So try to go see if you can get some experience, either with a professor, practical experience to see, oh, actually, I like this, but I don't like that. and just have an open mindset of the different jobs that maybe actually they are not what you think they are, and they can actually be good for you if you want to. So I think that's everything from me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was great. We have had a couple of questions coming in. They're both really relating to, I suppose, the degree that you did or that people do who go into your sort of job. So the first one is, if you do a biomedical engineering degree, or I guess maybe you can only comment on the one that you did, what's the kind of ratio of the kind of biomedical bit to the engineering bit?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Thank you. So I'm not sure about this course here in the UK because I did my course in Portugal. So at the time it was what is called an integrated master. So you do your bachelor's and master's in one go. And this was 5 years in total. So I only started the biomedical engineering on my 3rd year. And there is, I would say it's maybe like 50-50. Because it depends what you consider engineering as well, because there we work into what kind of materials we can use, how to test those materials. So there's a bit of physics, like how to measure the mechanical properties of a specific material, for instance. But then you also want to combine that with biology. So how is this material going to interact with the cells? And you need to do some more tests. So I would say maybe it's 50-50. But this was, again, back home, so I'm not sure how it is right here.
Okay, and I guess a sort of similar sort of question, really. So can you go into biomedical engineering having done just sort of straight engineering as your first degree?
Yeah, I would think so, because everything you are learning there, and you have to obviously have a different mindset because you're working with living things like this, that you need to feed the cells every couple of days. But I would think that is possible, absolutely. You may need some bit of extra work just to try to compensate, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. That is a great question.
Okay, I've just got one more question, and then I think we'll need to move on to the next speaker. They were just asking what are the newer areas of biomedical engineering today?
That's a good question. So there's lots of interesting things. You can work with tissue engineering. There's organ transplants as well. Like basically people take an organ, they take all the cells out of it, for instance, and they just have the structure, and then they put the patient's own cells in there and then to repopulate and then use it for transplants. There's 3D printing, for instance, that's very high at the moment, very hot at the moment. Electrospinning as well. There's a multitude of things that you can do.
Excellent. So quite an exciting sort of area of biomedicine to be working in, yeah. I guess. Yeah, it sounds like there's some very cool things going on. Okay, we're going to move to our next speaker now, who is Daniel Okana. And he's going to talk to you a bit about his work. He works in the Department of Pediatrics and normally works on childhood vaccinations, and he'll tell you a bit more about that. Daniel.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Daniel Okana, and I'd like to convince you at least to consider a fulfilling career in medical research. So there are many careers in medical research, and we'll hear a few examples today. I would like to give you a sense of my journey so far. So where am I at the moment? So I'm a bioinformatician based in the Oxford Vaccine Group, and that's part of the Department of Pediatrics here in the University of Oxford. And so what is a bioinformatician? So essentially what I do is I use informatics and data to describe, understand, and potentially to predict underlying biological processes. So why would I want to do that? So there's various reasons why I might want to do that. So we might think that through this information, we can develop new drugs and vaccines and maybe develop new diagnostic approaches. So an example of this sort of what question would be, I've looked previously at the genetic determinants of how well we respond to vaccines. So we look across our genomes and we look for particular genetic variations which are associated with how robust our responses are to vaccinations. And then through that information, we hope we can understand what really drives immune responses to vaccinations and how we optimize our responses and optimize our antibody responses if that's what we need in order to protect us against infectious diseases. So I find this job very rewarding. Ultimately, we know that our research can have real world impact on individuals and society. So working in the vaccine group, even before the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines save millions of lives. So estimated 20 million lives are saved over the last decade through vaccination. And of course, this last year or so has been particularly eventful with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which our group have been working on. And so this is now distributed 500 million doses to over 160 countries. And we're still in the early vaccination campaign in many places. So certainly, I feel that this is a very rewarding area to be working in and has a real world impact. So now I'd like to talk a little bit how I got to where I am at the moment. So I've always been inquisitive and curious about science and mathematics. I went to a state comprehensive school. Didn't actually know anyone who was in science or STEM subjects who had a career in that area. But I was really interested by the topics, so I chose biology, chemistry, computer science, and mathematics as A-levels. And so when I got to that stage where we look at prospectus and think, oh, what can I do now with these interests at the time, wasn't quite sure what career I could pursue with those. I looked through various degree courses and I chose biomedical sciences because it looked really interesting in terms of the underlying questions, and also had a career at the end of it, which I thought that could be my career as a biomedical scientist, because those are the individuals in the hospital that run the tests that tell us what conditions we have, the diagnostic tests that are run in the hospital. So I chose biomedical sciences, and I went to the University of Hertfordshire and studied my undergraduate for 3 years there. And during that time, my sort of interest and my passion for research and for asking these questions about why does something happen and sort of was nurtured more. And I got particularly interested in the immune system, which was a significant module of my undergraduate teaching. So at the end of my undergraduate, I was left thinking, so what is my next step? Should I go into a career, as I'd sort of entered the degree thinking that I would be a biomedical scientist and a nice safe career, and that would be what I would do? Or do I want to pursue my interests a little bit further and see what else I can learn? So I wasn't quite sure at that stage whether to do a PhD, so graduate studies, or a master's, or to get a job. And so actually there was an opportunity here in Oxford to have a research assistant post and do a master's, in a taught master's. So I thought that was a really interesting opportunity to get some exposure to research while also learning some more about the topics I was really interested in. So I did a master's in medical immunology, and I was in a research lab here in Oxford. In fact, the same lab that I'm in at the moment, which develops vaccines and works on clinical trials on vaccinations. So through my master's and my exposure to research, I really did continue to have an interest and really think, actually, I think research career is for me, and so I did my PhD here in Oxford in the same research group, because I just thought vaccines were the most important intervention that I could think of working on. Apart from clean water, they have the biggest impact on healthcare. So that's coming back to sort of where I am at the moment, and I'd just like to sort of finish off on sort of how my career to date sort of makes me feel and how rewarding it is. And being particularly involved in this Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, has really it's validated my career choices, I think, and I feel very close to this topic, and the realization that what you do has a real world impact and is impacting us all now. And it's very odd times seeing my colleagues on the news very frequently, but it's been very exciting and vibrant time to work in vaccine research. So just to finish off, I hope that I've given you a sense of my own career and why you might want to pursue a career in medical research. And the one last thing I would like to say is, when you're thinking about a career, you really want to look for something that's going to motivate you. It's going to get you out of bed in the morning and think what I'm doing is worthwhile. And I think it was Confucius that said, if you find a job that you love, you never have to work another day in your life. So that's where I'll finish off.
Thank you, Daniel. Very interesting. We do have a couple of questions about vaccines, and there's a more general question, which I think I'll save for the end. One of them is, what are the challenges of creating new vaccines quickly to combat diseases?
Well, so there's a number of challenges to developing vaccines. It really depends on what you want to vaccinate against. So there's a number of conditions that we've been trying to develop vaccines for decades, and there's refractory to developing vaccines because the underlying biology is complex. But the other part is the testing of the vaccine in order to show that the vaccine is safe and works is typically quite a substantial hurdle. So even when you have the science nailed down, if you know what you need to produce, it can still take a decade to develop a vaccine that's going to actually go into arms. So this situation has been quite different in that has been much quicker than usual. And that really does potentially dawn a new era of vaccinology in terms of the way you can move things quickly. And so many of the reasons for that is the sort of the global effort and everyone joining forces together to quickly move through all the stages that are needed to assess a vaccine. But the other angle of it is because the ongoing pandemic, there is the perfect situation to test a vaccine. So often what we wish to vaccinate against is fortunately relatively rare. So it does take a while to show vaccines work. In this case, because of the pandemic, when the vaccine was developed and was trialed, we could relatively quickly assess that these vaccines are indeed working.
Thank you for that, Daniel. And the other question about vaccines is, what is it that makes some vaccines more efficient than others? I guess we're used to seeing these efficiency rates for COVID vaccines being sort of mentioned in the news. So what makes something, I don't know, 50% effective or 80% effective? Is that something you can predict in advance, or do you just find out through the trials?
Well, so there are people who think they can predict in advance, but I guess you've got to consider that each vaccine developer thinks that their vaccine is going to be the best, so they have predicted that theirs will be the best in advance. What actually happens in the real world can be slightly different, but the actual question is complicated in itself. So if we're talking about vaccine efficacy, we have to think about what is the vaccine, what does it have to do? So the vaccines and the efficacy that readout that has been used for the COVID-19 pandemic has been protection against symptomatic infection for the most part. But if you follow these things very carefully, you may notice that the actual most important factor is protecting people against severe illness, which may not give us exactly the same measurement. So it may not be that one vaccine is better at doing that than the other, although based upon that initial measurement of against symptomatic disease, one vaccine might be better, but both vaccines might be equally good at preventing us from having severe illness, which in the case of COVID-19 is what we really want to avoid, people having to go to hospital and getting severely ill.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming in about vaccines later, but for now, we're going to move on to our last speaker. So our last speaker is Dimitris Doxinos, and he's going to tell us a bit more about what he does and how he got to where he is in his career. Dimitris.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation, and I really do hope that by sort of describing what I've done so far, I'll shed a little bit of light on what you can do in medical research and how you can arrive there, because in my experience, you don't necessarily need a well thought out plan to move forwards within the field. I was born in Greece, but I actually went to school locally, just down the road in Abingdon. What I wanted to do was not going to medical research at all. I wanted to go to medical school, and that's what I applied for in university. So the A levels that I took were maths, further maths, biology, chemistry, and physics. Now, that choice was predominantly because a lot of these actually revolved around numbers rather than language, and coming from a different country, it was more common ground than other subjects that could potentially be quite difficult for me at the time to sort of go into. For medicine, the only subject that I really needed was chemistry. And I think this relates to one question that I saw in the Q&A about going on to medical research, is that I think that for biomedical subjects, biology is probably an essential one. For medical physics and engineering, maths probably, but not for all. So I'm sure you will have some tutors at school that will be able to sort of guide you in terms of what A levels you have taken that might be tailored to that sort of thing. But as you'll see from what I'll say later, you can have some A levels that are completely relevant to what you'll do next in life. So when I applied to university, I got into med school in Sheffield. So I went up to Yorkshire and was there for quite a long time, and that's where I did my first sort of science project, and it was on motor neuron disease. I'm sure most of you have heard of it from the Ice Bucket Challenge, and Stephen Hawking, of course, had it. And that was a very, very short project that gave me a little bit of insight about what goes on with clinical samples and research. Now, my next project was actually in Birmingham, and it was completely different, and it gave me a sort of idea of what you can do in medical research with a completely different model. And we're studying genetics of some particular disorders, but they were actually done in fish. So there were genetic models because we share quite a lot of the genome, and we engineered them in a way to see how these genes affect development. And then at that time, I went sort of, hang on a minute. There is research that can be done in animal models. There is research that can be done in cells. There is research that can be done in human samples. And then how does that really link to the clinic, which was my initial sort of interest starting out in a career. So that's when I did a master's. So I went to Imperial College and I did a master's of research in clinical trial design and management and translational medicine. So basically what that involved was certification by the Medicines Health Regulation Authority, the MHRA, who basically approve clinical trials in the UK, plus another project, again in genetics and again in motor neuron disease. And at that time, there was this opportunity to be part, upon finishing my master's, to be part of a European consortium that offered PhDs through something called the Marie Curie Fellowship. Now, this was really exciting because it was already putting me into an environment where I would have collaborations with a lot of people that had very different expertise to mine, and also involved a bit of traveling. But the spanner, so to speak, in the works was that it wasn't actually on anything that I had done before. So coming from a neuroscience sort of background, this was kind of neuro, but it was on brain cancer. So this was my sort of inroad to oncology. In order to take this opportunity, I had to move from the place that I did all my training in. So I had to leave the UK, and I spent 3.5 years in France. This was a fantastic opportunity, not only to live in a different country, but also work in a different country and see how research works in different places, and sort of incorporate different research cultures as well as mentalities, and working together towards a common goal. And not only that, because there was this sort of pan-European collaboration, I managed to do very different things that I wouldn't really be able to do if I had stayed put in one place. So apart from the sort of clinical stuff that I was already quite familiar with, and the biological stuff that I was familiar with, I was able to do some bioinformatics training in Athens in Greece, and some in silico drug discovery and drug design in Sweden, and all of these tied into a big project which was basically trying to target a particular biochemical pathway in brain cancer. So after this finished, this underlying biochemical pathway just so happened to be studied by a group at the Nuffield Department of Surgery here in Oxford. But the difference there was that it wasn't in brain cancer, but it was in prostate cancer. And this is another example of how you don't have to follow a linear path through a clinical entity, but you could potentially follow the underlying science. So what I was hired to do was to apply all the things that I learned in brain cancer and the new drugs and molecules in a different sort of clinical setting. And at the same time, what I found really exciting was just being incorporated back into a surgical department. Because if we're thinking about sort of disease prediction, about treatment prediction, because a lot of people who develop cancer might not respond to therapies like everyone else would, then we need rather models to study diseases very close to the clinic. And if you're embedded in a surgical department, it means that there are a lot of surgeons around that could potentially provide samples to study the diseases further. This is what I'm doing at the moment. I'm trying to take biopsies, which are basically parts of people's cancers, parts of people's tumors that come out of surgery. And then I'm trying to keep them alive for about 10 days, because obviously if you take something out of the body, it's very difficult for it to stay alive and intact. But what that allows me to do is have a very good example of someone's tumor, but in a petri dish, in essence. So then what I'm doing to that is treating it with either conventional therapies or novel therapies, and then having a look at how it behaves. So then what that tells me is whether it will actually respond well to therapy, or whether we should consider a different type of therapy. And this is only one of the many things that you can do as part of our sort of collaborative group. So I hope it has been quite clear that there hasn't been a sort of concrete plan from A to Z throughout my career so far. So I started off in a completely different country, then came to the UK with a plan to be a clinician, but I have worked fully in medical research, sort of full-time medical research since 2011, so for quite a long time. And because there are so many things that you can do, and so many places you can visit, so many disciplines that you can collaborate with, that it becomes more and more and more exciting, because there is so much we don't know already. And as the other speakers have already said, everything we do has a real world application. So being embedded in this environment is really quite cool. You don't need to be particularly scared, if that's the right word, when thinking about a career. It's certainly, there will be uncertainty. Absolutely, you can't predict the future. But if you're interested, then you should definitely have a stab at it, and then you'll find something you're interested in, because there's so much out there, especially in medical science, to do. So yeah, any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Demetrius. Yes, we've had quite a few questions come in. I'm just trying to work out which ones are for you and which ones are sort of more generally for everyone. We have had one question saying, how did you decide that you wanted to career in medical research as opposed to medicine? And looking back, what do you wish you'd have known?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, it was entirely by chance. The projects that I did were really quite interesting, and also I have to say that I was very lucky that the teams that I was working under as an undergraduate were very accommodating, which means that they sort of painted a picture and an environment that I saw myself in. So if, for example, I had done a project that I didn't really understand, or people were really busy as expected and didn't really pay attention to me, I probably wouldn't have gone down that route at all. So this is an important component, because I'm sure that you have found out throughout all the 3 talks that people are very important within medical research. You have to work with them all day, every day for really long hours. So having that background and having quite good teams throughout my career so far has been a determining factor for me to keep going. And then also the projects have kind of worked. So it has been, if it's something positive, then it's a driving force to take that on the next project and the next project and the next project. And you're never too far away from the clinic either, because you might not be a medic yourself, but at the same time, you are within a team that involves them, So it really depends on whether you want to be treating people or generating the treatment for people. And there's a nuance there that you have to sort of figure out for yourself if you like it or not. So. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we had a question that was actually submitted in advance of the talk. Someone's not able to attend, and I think it was relating to the description of your talk. So it's asking, with regards to proteins and their role in health and disease, what makes a protein that normally has a beneficial function in the body pathological? What causes that change?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, I didn't really get too much into that because it was, within 10 minutes, it would have been a bit technical, but essentially what a protein has a very specific function, right? And normally it works fine. It falls within the puzzle pieces of life and moves on. So the sort of blueprint for the protein is in the DNA. So if, for example, you have a mutation, like, for example, a mutation in a gene that is promoting cancer, then this way a protein could become pathogenic. So you have basically the wrong type of protein in your body, and it's not that it's produced anew, it's just that it's produced wrong. And then that has downstream effects, sort of knock-on effects on generating cancer, for example, in this particular case. In motor neuron disease, to use the complete opposite example, we still have mutations, but what they do is that the body recognizes that they're faulty, but there are so many that it can't clear them out. So in each individual little cell, each individual little factory, there is a buildup of trash, essentially. And then the cells become so stressed that they start decaying, they start dying. And that's why you get those symptoms that you see in patients, the degeneration of the neurons. That's why there is no connection between the motor cortex in the brain to the muscles in the body. It's because all these proteins are faulty, and then they accumulate, and the sort of recycling system cannot cope, and that's where they die. So these are just 2 ways that sort of proteins can be they can sort of cause disease in a way.
Thank you, Demetrius. I'm now going to just open it up to everyone a bit more. So I'm just looking back to some of the earlier questions we've got. So we've got a question about how common is it to get a research position at university after doing your degree? I'm guessing they mean before you've done a PhD or further research. So I think, Daniel, you mentioned that, and also Joanna. So I don't know. Joanna, do you want to start, and then Daniel?
I think it is very common, at least from the group of people that I study with, for instance. Most of them went to research, but some went straight into doing PhDs, while others were doing just 6 months work here and there, for instance, because also the system in Portugal is slightly different than here. But it is very common. And then other people just went into industry as consultants, for instance, just to advise on some projects. But my experience is that is pretty common. But then people, as it was mentioned in other talks, they can change. They can decide to go to industry, or then they can go to industry and then decide to go to research.
Excellent. In fact, someone has asked about what's the benefit of doing research, going into research rather than going into industry, although I'm guessing you can do research in industry as well as you can do it in academia, I guess. Daniel, did you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, as Joanna said, there's lots of job opportunities in research for someone who's got a science degree. So research, industry, you can go straight into a PhD. That's quite common, but it's also very common to have a research post first, as I did, to have some exposure to research through a recent research assistant post. I actually would advise that a bit, because it's good to get some exposure before you commit to doing a 3 or 4 year PhD, so you know what you're getting yourself in for.
While you're there, Daniel, we did get a question, I think, that was more specifically about vaccines, so I'm just going to get you to talk a bit about that. How do you combat mutations of pathogens and vaccines then not working?
Yeah, so it really depends. So mutations, maybe the question is directed at the current situation with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which has these variants that we hear a lot about. So in the case of this particular pandemic, there are groups that are already looking to see whether we need to modify vaccines to use variant information, so to use the genetic material from the variant to produce a protein, which therefore should hopefully be the perfect target in vaccines. And so that's one solution. What is actually, people may not all be familiar with, in the case of flu, we do change our flu vaccines frequently. So we could change them every year to if you like, stay ahead of what's happening with the pathogen or the virus in that case. So yeah, it does actually depend on what organism we're looking at. So I hope that's a useful answer.
Thank you, Daniel. We've had a couple of questions about A levels. So whether you think that for going into medical research is maths an essential A level? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I kind of sort of answered that at the beginning of my talk. So there are some that are essential for specific degrees. So chemistry for medicine, biology for biomedical sciences. But as I said, having a science is good. And then as soon as you get admitted to any of those courses, then you'll be trained thoroughly in what you'll need for any further job and or further study. Yeah, to sort of go into the question about industry versus academic research, that again is a personal choice, where you rather, the best way of putting it is that one does not exclude the other. So you could quite easily go into research into industry straight after your first degree, your undergraduate degree, without having to do any master's, PhDs, or anything like that. It's just that in academic research, what you'll find is that you have a little bit more responsibility of driving projects yourselves. So there is a little bit more freedom, for lack of a better word, in academic research about what you can and cannot do, whilst industry generally works on client projects. So they get commissioned a particular job, they have to do that job, and you are a cog in a machine that is very good at producing results, which in and of itself is massively important. So to put that into perspective, you know, for every Oxford University Jenner, there is an AstraZeneca. For every BioNTech company, there is also the academic group that developed the vaccine there. Same for us, for the oncology sort of small molecules that we've made, we'll need someone to produce them. So there are benefits on both careers, and most people that I know will have, at some point, will have a go at both. For me, because I like to be sort of thinking and driving my own projects, I would probably consider going into industry later rather than earlier. If you wanted, for example, slightly more stable sort of job security and so on, you might want to go into industry first and then go into academic research. So again, I think it's a people thing. So you get advice wherever you can find it, and then you see what fits best for you. If that answers that.
Yep, thank you, Demetrius. There has been another question about the best degree to get into oncology research. I remember talking to a colleague of mine in oncology, and he said actually one of the things they were shortest of in his department at that time were physicists, because you spend a lot of time wanting to do specialized targeting of tumors, and for that it's really good to have that physics knowledge. So I would say, if you want to go into medical research, there are just a huge range of different disciplines that will allow you to enter. So if your motivation for doing medical research is that you want to improve people's health, then there's an enormous range of different degrees you can do that can lead into medical research. So there's a lot to be said just for doing the subjects that you enjoy the most and that you are the best at, which may be the same thing. And there are then often ways into medical research from there, and it can be quite surprising, the background of the people I meet. But I will ask Demetrius what he reckons as to the best degree for oncology.
Yeah, so it's again, so for example, for the project that I was doing before I came to Oxford, so just, you know, off the top of my head, you wanted a medical chemist, you wanted a biochemist, you wanted a medicinal chemist, a computational biologist, a bioinformatician, of course, then a cell biologist, a surgeon, a neurologist. So you can see the list goes on. So in terms of being involved in oncology, other than becoming an oncologist, as in an MD, then there are so many different ways that you can go about it. Because, yeah, as Natalie said, for example, medical physics is particularly important because it's not just the targeting. PET scanning, radiobiology for irradiation is very, very common in oncology. So you'd need some expertise in this, and imaging, medical imaging is really quite important as well. And I suppose a good way of looking at how the different specialties are being sort of described from a clinical perspective is to have a look at NHS science jobs, because then they will, you know, they go medical genetics, medical physics, medicinal chemistry, and so on and so forth. So if you want to look at it from a clinical perspective, you can have a look from that side and then decide how to best tailor your university degree to go towards that route. But I can guarantee you that they'll, you know, when you start your degree, you'll find something else that you're interested in, or you'll stick with it. It's very diverse. So.
Okay, I'm just aware that we haven't got a huge amount of time left. I'm just going to ask each of you what you wish you knew before you embarked on your careers, if you've got any advice for your younger self, or I guess our audience here today, about things to consider, or just things that you would have found reassuring to know. I think if we start with Joanna this time.
That is a very good question. My first instance would be to say, go to bioengineering or biomedical engineering straight out of high school. But actually going to pathology first taught me that, oh, I don't like this kind of work. This is not what I want. I would say maybe while I was in school, I wished I had more practical work outside of the program already. So we had lab classes, but I wish I would have go to a professor and say, hey, can I work with you for a couple of hours a week, just on a specific project, learn a bit more how to do publications, for instance, because I didn't know anything until getting out of the uni. But it kind of depends on the unis on that sense. Yeah, and then just try to enjoy uni as itself, not only as the course and the work, but also relax. It's gonna be fine. Just take your time to figure out what you want, what you need, and yeah, just go for your interests, and everything else will follow if you know exactly what you want. And sometimes if you can't find that, you can create that. I had many people who decided to just create their own companies on a specific project that they actually thought of during uni, and now they are getting funding from millions and millions on this specific project. So yeah, just work on that. Try to follow what you like.
Thank you, Joanna. Daniel, do you have anything you want to add?
Definitely. Was my first bit of advice would be to join webinars like this. I think this type of exposure is ideal, and everyone who's joined this, congratulate yourself, because you really are like sort of showing initiative amongst your peers to really know what you want to do and consider these types of careers from people who have lived them and are on their journeys. So related to that, if you know people who are in medical research, ask them questions, ask them loads of questions. If you don't know anyone, try to contact. A lot of people are willing to talk to you, because we're all passionate about what we do. So you'd be surprised that you might actually get some feedback. I think that is something I didn't have, and I wish I did have, because I just didn't know. I was learning these things as I go along, and that's what I would really sort of take home from this, is to continue to show the initiative you have to join this webinar, and go out there and be proactive and find out from people what they've experienced, and try to get a feel for what you might be interested in. But as the other speakers have said, it may change when you actually live through that experience, but try to set yourself on the right path.
Thank you. Demetrius, was there anything you wanted to add?
Not really. I mean, what I would really have liked to know beforehand, especially on the sort of medical research side, because I didn't really set out to do it, was for someone to give me the opportunity to have a look at what a typical day looks like. Yeah, as Daniel said, as Joanna said, you know, attending these webinars is really good, and hopefully, COVID permitting, get on as many sort of work experience schemes as you can, because you can sort of have a first-hand look on what an everyday today life in a job of a scientist looks like, which means that you'll have a feel of what to expect on an everyday life. And then also I just saw a very important question in the chat, which is how do you deal with failure and undesirable results in medical research? And this is basically the blessing and the curse of this particular line of work, because you have to sort of take into your stride that because you're working on the unknown, and I'm not exaggerating, this is work textbooks are not written. So what we're doing is on stuff that no one has done before. You expect to fail. it's not, you have to know that about 70% of the stuff you do doesn't work, which gives you information for the stuff that will work. So learning this from your peers and from people who have a lot more experience than you early on means that it will set you up for a much healthier outlook in the job should you decide to go into.
Thank you, Demetrius. I've just noticed that we really are running out of time now. This is the last of these talks for a little while. We are planning to have a series of talks in the week of the 5th to the 9th of July. Those are tied in with some online work experience that we're running, but they will be open to anyone who's interested to come along. I'd just like to really thank all of our speakers here today. It's been excellent. And we've had some great questions today. So I'd really like to thank our audience for coming along. You've made an effort to come here. It's not even during school time. So thank you for coming. And thanks for all your brilliant questions, because that makes all the difference in the world, being able to answer questions that are interesting to you. Thank you.